The alarm was already screaming when I pulled myself out of my bunk. Not the soft proximity ping or the yellow level hull warning. This was the full red alarm, the one that shakes the walls and makes your back teeth vibrate until your skull feels like it's about to crack. I had my boots on before my eyes were fully open. 11 years in the field teaches you that. You stop waiting to understand the situation before to move. Understanding is a luxury. Moving is a survival instinct. I ran through the narrow, cold corridors of the Harbinger, the overhead lights cycling between white and red in a rhythm that felt like a heart deciding whether to stop beating. I was already mental checking the list of catastrophes: drive failure, hull breach, collision. I did not have crew malfunction on that list. I should have. When I reached the bridge, Owen Kowalski was standing at the central console. He was 22 years old with soft hands and a face that still looked surprised when things went wrong. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the viewport. I followed his gaze and felt the air leave my lungs. The structure outside had not been there 20 minutes ago. It was taking up the entire forward view the way a wall takes up your vision when you walk into it in the dark, except this wall was the size of a small moon. It was made of something that was not metal and was not stone. It was a material absent from every database I had ever read, shifting colors at the edges like light itself wasn't sure how to bounce off it. Millions of points of pale gold light ran across its surface in patterns too deliberate to be random and too vast to be decorative. It looked like a city coming back to life after a very long night. I said his name once, low, Kowalski. He whispered that he barely touched it. He found a panel, it was glowing, and he thought it was a navigation beacon. I counted to 3 inside my head. It's a technique I learned after Europa when I realized my first response to catastrophic stupidity was always something I would regret saying out loud. You touched an unidentified panel on an uncharted structure, I said. A structure that appeared on no survey map, no chart, and no recorded mission log in the history of human deep space exploration. He told me it was very small. The structure lit up another 10,000 points of light while he was saying it. Petra Cole, our systems lead, was already at the scanner station. She stayed calm during emergencies because she found them more interesting than frightening. She told me the thing was the diameter of a mid-sized moon and mostly hollow. There were organized structures inside, thousands of them. Chambers, all the same size, sealed and stacked in rows from the core outward. I asked her how many. 17,000 and change, she said. The Harbinger had a crew of 9. I pulled up the comm panel and started a transmission to Earth. Command, knowing the delay would be 40 minutes each way. I recorded our coordinates and our situation, ending with a direct order to the crew not to touch another goddamn thing. I looked at Kowalski when I said it. He looked at his hands. Then the structure groaned. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was the sound a mountain would make if mountains had voices and had been holding their breath longer than human. Civilization had existed. It came through the hull, through the floor plates, and through the soles of my boots, sitting inside my chest like a second heartbeat. Then the doors opened. Not one, not a row. 17,000 doors opened at the same time with the slow deliberateness of something that has never needed to hurry. The sound was enormous. Every comm channel we had, every frequency from navigational to emergency lit up at once. The translation software took 11 seconds to process the noise. When it finished, it produced a single line of text in uncertain italics, allegiance confirmed. I stood there, the red light still cycling, and read those 2 words 3 times. I reached into my jacket pocket and touched the folded papers there. Discharge paperwork, signed, dated. I was 3 days from done. Then the first one stepped out of the vault. It was 9 feet tall. Its armor looked less like something worn and more like something grown, catching the gold light and holding it the way deep water holds a secret. It moved with the settled weight of a tectonic plate. It looked at our ship, looked at the 9 of us through the glass, and it went down on one knee. Behind it, from 17,000 open doors, the motion repeated. Tens of thousands of them settling into a 200,000-year-old acknowledgement. The bridge was silent until Kowalski whispered another apology. I didn't answer. My hands were in my pockets, and they weren't shaking. That was the part that frightened me most. My first transmission back from Earth Command arrived 39 minutes later. It was one word. Hello, that was it. No instructions, no status check. Just a four-letter question that meant the entire communications department was as terrified as I was. I told them to try again and turned back to the viewport. 17,000 ancient soldiers were kneeling in the vacuum, waiting for me to say something. They had the stillness of things that measured time in epochs. We established a basic link within 2 hours using a translation key the structure had been broadcasting for 200 millennia. The largest soldier, the one I started calling Gerald, requested a tactical assessment of our military. I authorized Petra to send our public records. Gerald was silent for a long time. Then he asked about the weapons we used most frequently. I explained ammunition. I explained that our weapons were reusable, that we reloaded them. Gerald's armor shifted through light patterns that Nate, our comms specialist, interpreted as deep fascination. In the ancient wars, their weapons were singular events. The concept of a gun you could use, reload, and use again was as alien to them as their moon-sized vault was to us. I spent 40 minutes explaining mechanized warfare and the wheel. Gerald found the wheel especially interesting. We were still talking when Petra flagged me while a sensor returned. 300,000 kilometers out and closing at military speed. A formation, not a patrol, a fleet. Voth, Petra said. I had never heard the name, but in the ancient records the word appeared as often as the word enemy. They were watching the structure, waiting for someone to open it. And now they were 48 hours from arrival. I asked Gerald if they were a problem. The translator flagged his response as needing context, but the core was clear. The Voth were the reason they had gone to sleep. Their last commander had chosen to wait for the right person to wake them. I asked how that person was identified. Gerald's light pattern shifted for 17 seconds before the translator gave me the answer. By being the one the allegiance confirmed for. I looked at the screen showing the Voth formation. Then I looked at the second message from Earth Command. A general was being dispatched. I was ordered to stand down. But as I watched the ancient army outside my window, I realized the general was coming for a command he would never truly hold, because Gerald wasn't looking for a uniform, he was looking for me. General Arthur Kane arrived on the Harbinger 47 hours later, his arrival heralded by the hiss of a pressurized docking tube and the rhythmic stomp of 4 aides who looked like they had been polished to a mirror shine. Kane was 56, wearing a dress uniform that had more medals for administrative excellence than I had years in the service. He walked onto my bridge with a data card in his hand and a prepared speech on his lips, a man accustomed to rooms falling silent the moment he entered. He looked through the viewport at Gerald, who still stood at the head of his silent kneeling army, and began to speak of humanity's destiny and the legal framework of galactic salvage. Gerald didn't move. He didn't produce a single light pattern or shift a centimeter of his posture. The 17,000 soldiers behind him remained as still as the vacuum they inhabited. When Kane finished his address, standing tall with the expectation of an answer, Gerald looked past him. He looked directly at me. In one unified, terrifyingly silent movement, the entire army shifted their attention. Thousands of eyes, ancient and heavy with the weight of epochs, fixed on a mid-level sergeant from Chicago. Kane turned around slowly, his face a mask of controlled irritation that was rapidly beginning to crack into something like realization. I didn't give him time to recover his dignity. I reached for my comm channel and asked Gerald for a situation report. The light patterns responded instantly, focused and organized, bypassing the general entirely as if he were nothing more than a piece of decorative furniture. Kane started to speak, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous tone officers use when they are being ignored, but I cut him off. "General, you have 46 hours before a Voth attack fleet arrives," I said. I explained that the Valkyrie would not respond to his authority and that our window to prepare a defense was closing. He didn't like being told the truth by a salvage contractor. He spent 4 minutes making his feelings clear before retreating to the secondary conference room, leaving me to the real work. Gerald's historical data on the Voth began streaming in faster than Nate's key could process it. It was a meticulous archive of 200,000 years of conflict. The Voth were methodical and patient. They planned operations across timescales that made human strategic thinking look like a grocery list. They didn't rush. They didn't improvise. They had spent the last 200 millennia perfecting counter-protocols for every formation the Valkyrie had ever used. Every tactic, every approach, every signature in Gerald's memory had a documented Voth response waiting for it. They were prepared for the army they knew, but they were not prepared for us. I was standing at my console with a cup of cold, bitter coffee when Kowalski appeared at my elbow. He had become a sort of unofficial liaison because Gerald had developed a scholarly interest in everything the boy said, likely because Kowalski was the first source of new information the alien had encountered in 200,000 years. Kowalski told me he had an idea, and before I could tell him no, he suggested we pretend to surrender. He argued that if the Voth were matching patterns, they would expect the Valkyrie to fight, back with the same honor they always had. He pulled up a hand-drawn diagram on his tablet, a mess of circles and arrows with one shape that I assumed was the Harbinger. I looked at the diagram, then I called Gerald. I asked him if in his entire history of war they had ever used a feigned retreat as a tactical opening. The translator produced a single word, no. I asked if anyone had ever used deception against the Voth. Gerald's response was longer this time. Deception in warfare was not a concept present in Valkyrie doctrine. All positions were declared, all engagements were direct. I realized then that they had been fighting a losing war for thousands of years simply because they were too honorable to lie. I told Gerald to explain the concept of a fake to his people, not to compromise their values, but to show the Voth something they had no protocol for. Gerald was silent for 11 seconds before the translator gave me his answer, explain this fake. Kowalski took the channel explaining deception through analogies of card games and sports for 22 minutes, while Gerald engaged with a focus that was almost unnerving. By the time we were 31 hours from engagement, the Valkyrie were moving. They shifted into a front-wider swath than most planetary systems with a precision that made the word ready feel insufficient. The Voth fleet advanced in their methodical pattern, exactly as the records predicted, locking into their counter-protocol formation. I told Gerald to fall back slowly and let them push. I can only imagine the confusion in the Voth command centers when the army that had never retreated in history began to give ground. They pushed forward into the gap, into the trap that was closing behind them while they were still celebrating their progress. The engagement lasted 19 minutes. It was the fastest victory in the Valkyrie archives, where the previous record was 6 days. But as the last Voth ship jumped to light speed, a single transmission hit our array, one that wasn't meant for our ears. Nate read it twice, his face going pale in the red light of the bridge. It says they didn't come for the army, Nate whispered. They came to see who woke them. Now they know. The bridge of the Harbinger was so silent I could hear the hum of the air recyclers struggling against the heat of the consoles. Nate's words hung in the air like a death sentence. They didn't come for the army. They came for the one who woke them. I looked at the scanner, watching the last residual traces of the Voth jump drives fade into the background radiation of deep space. It wasn't a victory, it was a verification. 6 hours later, the second transmission arrived, buried in a frequency so compressed it required Gerald's own communication array to pull it from the noise. It was a 3-part message, and Nate brought it to me without a word. The first part informed us that the fleet we had just dismantled was a reconnaissance force, 1/8 of the total Voth presence in this sector. The second part was a timer. The main fleet was 3 days out, running at full burn without deceleration. They weren't coming to talk. The third part was the one that made my hands go cold in my pockets. It said, "We know what follows the one who wakes the old army. We have been waiting for this, Commander. We have something older than the Valkyrie, and it is already moving." I called Gerald immediately. His light pattern started before I could Even opened the channel, shifting into a deep morning blue that Nate said felt like grief. He told me the truth about the Valkyrie then. They weren't built as a species. They were an engineered army created by a civilization that no longer existed to follow a specific profile. A set of characteristics that mathematics predicted would produce the right commander at the right moment. The system had scanned every soul. On the Harbinger, the second Kowalski touched that panel. It had run its assessment in the 11 seconds before the doors opened. It had found one match. I asked him what the criteria were. Tactically flexible under pressure, the translator read. Capable of using loss as a tool rather than a wound. No interest in recognition. Instinct toward protecting others that outweighs instinct toward self-preservation. Has survived a defining moment of catastrophic failure and continued functioning. I stared at that last word, functioning. Not thriving, not recovering. Just moving forward because stopping wasn't an option. I realized then that the Vault hadn't been looking for a hero. It was looking for a ghost who still knew how to fight. I asked Gerald what the Voth had used to stop them last time. His lights choose precision over speed, flickering slowly. They had recovered a weapon system from a civilization even older than the Valkyrie's creators, a weapon of negation. It didn't use firepower. It stripped away the Valkyries' coordination, their armor, their network. It forced 17,000 elite soldiers to fight as 17,000 isolated individuals. It made them fight alone. The last commander had chosen to seal the Vault rather than watch her people be slaughtered in the silence of that negation. She had gambled everything on the hope that someone would eventually come who could find a different answer. I was still processing the weight of that gamble when General Kane knocked on the bridge door. He came in with a document from Earth Command that had been through 3 rounds of committee review. It was 11 paragraphs of bureaucratic, posturing that boiled down to one demand. The Valkyrie were to be folded into Earth's military structure with Kane as the official commanding officer and me as a tactical advisor. I read the part about tactical advisor 3 times while Kane watched me, waiting for my compliance. I looked him in the eye and told him we had 3 days before a fleet arrived with a weapon designed to strip this army of its soul, and he wanted to discuss legal standing. The command structure, I said, is whoever Gerald listens to. To my surprise, Kane didn't argue. He sat down in the nearest chair, looked at the sensor readings of the approaching doom, and told me to tell him what I needed. He had realized that winning was more important than his ego. We spent the next 4 hours in deep consultation with Gerald. He spoke of the last commander, woman who had led them for 60,000 years and drew the lines the galaxy lived inside without knowing they existed. She had carried the weight of every loss until she couldn't anymore. I went back to my cabin that night and pulled out my discharge papers. I sat on the edge of my bunk, feeling the worn edges of the life I had tried to walk away from. 11 years of pragmatism, 2 years of being at peace with being done. Gerald had named my secret in a single sentence. You stopped leading because the ones you led stopped existing. I didn't throw the papers away. I just stared at them as the red alarm began to vibrate through the floor again. The Voth full fleet had arrived 17 hours early, and they were coming at us like a hammer. I was on the bridge in 4 minutes, my boots striking the floor with a hollow metallic echo that felt like a countdown. The screen didn't just show a fleet, it showed an extinction event. This was the full weight of the Voth military, thousands of ships arriving with the cold, calculated patience of a predator that had finally been given permission to kill. Petra put the count on the main screen, the numbers, climbing so fast they blurred. Gerald already knows, Nate said from the comm station. The Valkyrie picked up the signature before we did. He's waiting on you. I stood at my console, the red light cycling over General Kane's dress uniform as he watched the tactical display. He didn't say a word, which was the first time I actually respected him. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the discharge papers. They were folded, the edges soft and gray from the years I'd spent reaching in to touch them just to remind myself that an exit existed. I looked at the signature, the date, the life I was supposed to start in 72 hours. Then I reached across to Kowalski's console and grabbed his lighter. The papers caught slow and sideways, the flame eating through the legal jargon of my surrender. There was nothing cinematic about it. It was just paper turning to ash in an empty coffee cup. When the last corner went black, I opened the channel to Gerald. "Gerald, full formation," I said. "I want the negation weapon located before they're in range. Everything else waits until we have that position." The light patterns flashed a brilliant, determined amber. Outside, 17,000 soldiers shifted. They didn't move like a human army with the lag of individual commands. They moved like a single thought expressed in 17,000 bodies. I spent the next 40 minutes staring at the Voth formation with Gerald. The negation weapon was the priority. Without it, the Valkyrie were untouchable. With it, we were just 9 humans and a crowd of confused giants. Gerald's analysis was immediate. The weapon would be at the center, protected by the densest layer of ships, a doctrine built on the assumption that no force could penetrate deep enough before it activated. "They expect us to go around the edges," I muttered. "They think we'll try to fight our way through the wall." Gerald confirmed this. No force in his 200,000-year archive had ever attempted a direct approach. It was considered reckless. I looked at the shimmering wall of Voth steel and felt a familiar, cold clarity settle into my bones. "Then I need 8 reckless soldiers," I said. "I want them to move the second the Voth commit to their approach before they even have a targeting solution." Gerald was silent for 7 seconds, a lifetime in a digital war. Then his light pattern shifted into a sequence Nate had never seen. "Who leads the 8?" he asked. I didn't look at Kane or Petra. I looked at the stars. "I lead them," I said. The bridge went silent. Kowalski stopped breathing. I opened the crew channel and told them the plan was simple. We were going to remove the only asset that changed the math. 8 Valkyrie and 1 sergeant from Chicago driving straight into the heart of a god complex. We hit the negation weapon before they know we're there, or we don't come back at all. The silence on the channel was broken by Nate's whisper of confirmation, then Petra's, then Kowalski, who managed to apologize for the panel one more time. I didn't tell him it was okay. I just watched the Voth fleet grow larger on the screen, a hammer falling through the dark, unaware that we weren't planning to be the anvil. The hangar of the Harbinger was a cavern of pressurized silence when I stepped into the pilot seat of the rapid response cutter. 8 Valkyrie ships, each twice the size of mine and carved from that same light-hungry obsidian, drifted into formation alongside me. They didn't need a countdown. I could feel their presence through the sync link Nate had jury-rigged between our systems. General Kane's voice crackled. Over the private channel, stripped of its usual bureaucratic polish and sounding like a man who was watching a car crash in slow motion. "Sergeant, if you miss that window, the Voth will erase you before Gerald can even flinch," he said. I told him to keep the bridge warm for me and cut the feed. My hands were steady on the controls, the familiar weight of the flight stick grounding me as the Voth fleet reached engagement range. They moved with the terrifying grace of a glacier, thousands of ships interlocking their shields to form a wall of static and steel. Gerald's main force of 17,000 began their advance, a vast golden wave meant to fix the Voth's attention on the horizon. The moment the first Voth battery opened fire, the entire sector of space screamed with energy. It was the signal. I hit the thrusters, and the 8 Valkyrie accelerated with me, moving from a standstill to combat velocity in a heartbeat. We weren't flying around the formation, we were driving straight into the teeth of it. The Voth doctrine assumed we would be too busy dying on the perimeter to notice the center, but we were already past the outer pickets before their automated turrets could even rotate. I saw the negation weapon then, a jagged, pulsing core of violet light suspended between 4 massive dreadnoughts at the very heart of the fleet. It was beautiful in the way a predator is beautiful right before it strikes. We were 6 seconds from contact when the first Voth pulse hit us, a structural impact that threw me against my harness and filled the cockpit with the smell of ozone and toasted electronics. One of the Valkyrie beside me took a direct hit to its drive core and spun out, but it didn't stop. It kept firing as it drifted, clearing a path through a swarm of interceptors that hadn't expected anyone to be this far in. My HUD was flickering, a mosaic of warning lights and static, but I could still see the violet core. We were the only things moving in a world that had suddenly decided to stand still. I screamed at the remaining 7 to lock targets. Voth were adapting now, their formation shifting inward like an eye closing to protect its pupil. We were 3 seconds away, the violet light of the negation weapon beginning to expand, preparing to wash over the entire battlefield and strip the army of its soul. If it fired now, the Valkyrie main force would become a disorganized crowd of giants, and the war would be over before it truly began. I gripped the stick, pushed the engines into the red, and watched the distance-to-target counter drop to 0. The impact was not a sound, but a vibration that traveled through my marrow and into the deck plates of the cutter. We didn't just fire, we collided with the reality of the Voth's most guarded secret. 7 beams of concentrated Valkyrie light converged on the violet core at the exact moment I dumped my entire payload of proximity mines into the weapon's cooling vent. For 6 seconds, the universe went gray. In those 6 seconds, the negation weapon activated, a dying gasp of a god. On the Harbinger, I knew Petra would be seeing a flatline on her sensors. Gerald would be feeling the silence, the sudden sickening isolation as the network that made him a commander vanished. I felt it too, a psychic void that made me forget my own name for a heartbeat. Then the violet core didn't just stop, it shattered. The vacuum of space was momentarily filled with a debris cloud of ancient Voth technology, and the remaining 7 Valkyrie, their golden light surging back to full intensity as the network reconnected. I pulled the stick hard to the left, narrowly missing the burning hull of a Voth dreadnought that was beginning to list. Behind us, 17,000 soldiers felt the surge. Gerald's voice didn't come over the comms, his intent did. The wave of gold light on the horizon didn't just advance, it accelerated. The Voth fleet, which had been a wall of methodical order just minutes ago, was now a fractured mess of ships trying to protect a center that no longer existed. I sat in my cockpit, breathing in the smell of scorched wire, watching the distance-to-target counter start to climb as I drifted away from the wreckage. My HUD was a graveyard of red icons, and my left arm felt like it was made of lead, but I was still functioning. I opened the channel to the bridge, my voice sounding like it had been dragged through gravel. "Petra, status," I said. There was a pause, a ragged exhale of air from the other side. "Confirmed destruction of the primary asset," she said. "The Voth fleet is breaking formation. They're running, Dara." I looked at the stars, but they weren't the same anymore. They were being crowded out by the brilliance of an army that had forgotten how to stop. Gerald's channel opened, and for the first time his light patterns weren't tactical, they were deep, resonant blue. "It is done," the translator rendered. I told him for now. But as I watched the Voth ships jumping to light speed, I saw something else on the edge of the sensor range. A single ship. Massive, older than anything we had seen yet, and it wasn't running. It was waiting. The massive ship didn't broadcast a challenge, and it didn't charge its weapons. It just sat there. A gargantuan slab of pitted ancient obsidian that made the Voth dreadnoughts we'd just shattered look like toys. Petra's voice came back, thinner this time, reporting that the ship's signature wasn't matching the Voth fleet. It was older. It was the thing they had recovered. Gerald's light patterns shifted from that, resonant blue into a rapid, jagged pulse of white. The translator struggled, spitting out fragments of words. The origin, the first silence. I felt a cold prickle on the back of my neck that had nothing to do with the failing life support in my cutter. This wasn't another battle. This was a witness. Before I could order the remaining 7 Valkyrie to regroup, a transmission tore through every speaker in my cockpit, bypassing the encryption and the noise reduction filters. It wasn't a voice. It was a pressure, a rhythmic thrumming that felt like it was trying to rewrite my heartbeat. Nate's voice broke through on the command link, shouting that the Harbinger was losing primary power. General Kane was in the background, his voice tight and authoritative, demanding a shield cycle that didn't exist. I looked at the ancient ship, and for a second the stars around it seemed to dim. as if the vessel were drinking the light from the sector. It wasn't attacking the Valkyrie, it was scanning me. The sensation was a physical weight, a needle-sharp intrusion into the base of my skull that brought up memories I'd buried under 11 years of salvage contracts. The smell of burning plastic on the Europa station, the weight of my commander's dog, tags in my hand, the silence of a radio channel that should have been full of voices. The first silence wasn't a weapon of destruction, it was a weapon of memory. It was looking for the crack in the profile Gerald had mentioned. It was looking for the moment I stopped being a sergeant and became a ghost. I gripped the flight stick, my knuckles white, and told Nate to narrow the feed. I told him to find out where that signal was anchored. Gerald's ships began to circle the first silence, but they weren't firing. They were hovering, their golden lights flickering in a confused rhythmic stutter. They couldn't target it. It was like trying to punch a shadow. Gerald's light patterns were a chaotic mess of colors now, and the translator finally settled on a single terrifying phrase. "She is here." I asked him who. The answer came, back in a whisper of light that made my HUD go dark. The one who chose to wait. The realization hit me harder than the Voth kinetic rounds. The last commander wasn't a legend or a historical footnote. She was the ghost inside that obsidian hull, and she was currently tearing through my mind like a scavenger through a wreck. My cockpit was freezing now, the life support losing its fight against the void, but I couldn't stop the feed. Nate's voice came through a haze of static, screaming that the first silence was slaving our systems to its own broadcast. It wasn't just scanning me, it was broadcasting me. Every failure I'd ever hidden, every face I'd left behind on Europa was being converted into a data stream and pulsed out to the 17,000 Valkyrie. It was a test of worthiness or a trial by fire, and I was the one on the altar. I saw the bridge of the Harbinger through my auxiliary camera. Kane was white-faced, Kowalski was trembling, and Petra was fighting a losing battle to shield the crew from the psychic bleed. I told Nate to cut the transmission, to isolate the bridge, but my voice was a ghost of itself. The first silence didn't want the general. It wanted the sergeant who had burned her exit strategy in a coffee cup. Gerald's light pattern suddenly synchronized into a blinding, painful white, a frequency that shouldn't have been possible. The 17,000 soldiers didn't just hover. They began to vibrate in unison with the obsidian ship, their golden armor turning a pale, ghostly silver. The translator shrieked and then settled into a voice that wasn't Nate's or Gerald's. It was hers. It was a sound like shifting tectonic plates and dry wind. "You carry the weight of the fallen and you do not break." The voice echoed not through the speakers but directly in the fluid of my inner ear. "You lead because you have nothing left to lose, but the Voth have learned from my mercy. They do not fear the army. They fear the one who can make the army cruel." I saw the first silence begin to move then, not toward me, but toward the retreating Voth fleet, its hull expanding like a ribcage. It wasn't a ship of war, it was a forge. And inside that forge, something was waking up that had been hungry for 200,000 years. I looked at the scanner. The Voth reconnaissance fleet was gone, but the main fleet was already dropping out of warp on the far side of the sector. They hadn't run. They had just moved to make room for their own first silence. I told Gerald to hold the line, to ignore the memory bleed, but the Valkyrie were slowing down. They were drowning in the grief of 60,000 years of war, and I was the only anchor they had left. I realized then that I had to do more than just function. I had to choose. I told Nate to open a wideband channel to every Valkyrie in the sector, including the ones inside the first silence. I told him to give me everything the Harbinger had left in its batteries. I wasn't going to lead them with a speech. I was going to lead them with the one thing the Voth and the last commander didn't have. I was going to show them why humans keep moving when the world ends. Nate did it. He bypassed every safety relay on the Harbinger, venting the coolant into space just to keep the transmitter from melting as I flooded the wideband channel. I didn't send a tactical map or a battle cry. I sent the data stream of my own life, unfiltered and raw. I gave them the smell of Chicago rain on hot asphalt, the sound of my mother's voice before I left for the stars, and the crushing, mundane weight of the 11 years I spent sorting salvage just to keep from thinking about the friends I lost on Europa. I let them feel the exhaustion in my marrow and the terrifying, stubborn fact that I'd gotten out of bed every single morning anyway. The 17,000 Valkyrie, caught in the first silence's loop of ancient grief, suddenly shuddered. Their silver armor didn't turn back to gold. It ignited into a violent, sun-bright white. They weren't drowning in the past anymore. They were anchored to a person who was still breathing in the present. I saw the Voth main fleet hesitate, their sensors probably screaming at the sudden energy spike. They had expected an army paralyzed by its own history, but they got an army fueled by a human's refusal to stop. Gerald's light pattern stabilized into a blinding strobe. "We see you," the translator whispered. And it wasn't just Gerald's voice, it was 17,000 of them. "We see the continuation." The first silence groaned, its obsidian hull buckling as the Valkyrie inside it surged with a new frantic purpose. The last commander's voice echoed one last time, no longer a judgment, but a sigh of relief. "Finally," she said, "someone who knows how to carry a ghost." I didn't wait for the Voth to recover. I gave Gerald the order to engage, and the Valkyrie didn't move in a formation. They moved in a frenzy. They tore into the Voth main fleet with a desperation that made our previous 19-minute victory look like a rehearsal. They weren't fighting for honor or allegiance. They were fighting because they had finally been given permission to be as stubborn as the species that woke them. But the Voth weren't done. From the center of their massive flagship, a beam of pure negation, 10 times larger than the one we had destroyed, began to charge, targeting the Harbinger directly. They had realized that the army wasn't the threat. I was the threat. I gripped the stick of my damaged cutter, my eyes burning from the radiation, and realized there was only one way to stop it before it erased my crew. I told Nate to tell Kowalski I wasn't mad about the panel, and I aimed my nose at the Voth flagship's main reactor. The vacuum of space didn't carry the sound of the Harbinger's desperate maneuvers, but I felt the ship's agony through the deck plates of my cutter. The Voth flagship, a monolithic slab of geometry named the Eye of Orthodoxy, was bleeding light as the Valkyrie fleet shredded its outer layers, yet that central aperture, the negation beam, continued its inexorable swell. It looked like a hole being punched through the universe. I pushed the throttle past the red line, the thrusters screaming as they fought to align my small, battered frame with the flagship's core. "Nate, tell them to stop me," I whispered into the comms, a part of me hoping for a miraculous veto, but Nate's voice came back cracked and wet. "Captain, Kowalski says if you scratch the paint on the flagship, he's filing a grievance." It was a lie to keep the air from thinning, and we both knew it. I locked my inertial dampeners to 0, feeling the G-force flatten my lungs against my spine. Around me, the 17,000 ghosts in their silver shells realized my intent. Gerald's light patterns shifted from a frantic strobe to a steady morning violet. They didn't move to intercept me. They moved to clear a path. They were a funeral procession at Mach speeds. As the Eye of Orthodoxy unleashed the first flicker of its negation beam, the sheer pressure of the energy distorted the space around my cutter, warping my view into a kaleidoscope of static and heat. I wasn't just a pilot anymore. I was a kinetic slug aimed at the heart of an empire's ego, 10 kilometers, 5. The radiation alarm in my cockpit became a single flat tone. I saw the reactor core, a pulsing sun of violet power, deep within the Voth's obsidian ribs. I closed my eyes, thinking of the tea I never finished back on the Harbinger, and pulled the trigger on the emergency fuel purge, turning my entire ship into a shaped charge. The impact wasn't a sound. It was the sudden, absolute end of the weight of my own body. I woke to the smell of ozone and the taste of copper, but the weightlessness was gone, replaced by the heavy artificial thrum of the Harbinger's medbay. I wasn't vapor, I was just broken. My vision cleared to find Gerald, not his physical shell, but a projection of his light code shimmering on the wall, and Nate, whose face was a map of exhaustion and relief. "The Valkyrie," I rasped, my throat feeling like it had been scrubbed with glass. "They caught you," Nate whispered, clutching a data pad with trembling hands. "Gerald, he led them. They didn't just clear a path, they formed a kinetic net. They pulled you out of the cockpit nanoseconds before the cutter hit the core. Beyond the viewing port, the Eye of Orthodoxy was a graveyard of drifting obsidian shards, its negation beams snuffed out by the very ghosts it tried to silence. The Voth main fleet had retreated into the dark, leaving behind a silence that finally felt like peace rather than a threat. Gerald's violet light pulsed softly, a rhythmic hum that matched my own heartbeat. "The last commander says the debt is paid," the translator hummed, its voice now layered with 17,000 subtle harmonies. We had won a 19-minute war that lasted an eternity, but as I looked at my crew, Kowalski swearing at a flickering panel in the doorway, Nate finally letting out a jagged breath, I realized the ghosts weren't gone. They were just part of the crew now, anchoring us to a future we had earned by refusing to let go of the past. I reached for the lukewarm cup of tea Nate held out, my hand shaking, and for the first time in my life I didn't mind the wait.